Council. Good to go.
I'm going to call this meeting of the Zoning Subcommittee to order. Mr. Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Council Drinkwater.
Here.
Council Leahy.
Here.
Council Yim.
Here.
3 present.
Thank you for joining. The topic on the agenda tonight is a discussion on proposed zoning changes for a transit-oriented development overlay district. These changes have been discussed by this subcommittee before in draft form. They are changes that are largely required under a state law, the MBTA Communities Law, which is encouraging transit-oriented development in all communities near an MBTA station, which includes Lowell as a host community for the commuter rail. So we have discussed these changes before in draft form back in the month of August, but since that time, there has been some additional guidance and final language from the state, as I understand it, and our draft zoning changes have been updated accordingly. So we are joined here in the chamber tonight by staff from the Department of Planning and Development, Assistant City Manager and Director of the Department, Giovanni Baez-Rose, as well as Francesca Sigliano and Camilo Espetia. My understanding is that there will be a presentation given here tonight on the proposed changes by Ms. Sigliano and Mr. Espetia. So at this point in the meeting, I will hand it over. Well, I'll first open it up for any comments by members of the subcommittee, and if there are any, speak now. If hearing none, I will turn it over to Ms. Sigliano and Mr. Espetia for a presentation. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, councilors. Thank you for having us here. My name is Camilo Espetia. I'm the Deputy Director of the PD, and I'm here with Fran Sigliano, who's our Senior Planner at the Development Services Department. And before walking you through the details of what the ordinances are, I just wanted to give a little bit of a background of where we are today and why we're here today. You may remember last year we were here talking about how we were going to go about this project because we had received a grant from the state to hire a consultant and help us draft the ordinances. And because it had become recently a requirement from MBTA with caveats that Fran will walk you in details as follows. But it was really 2 years before that we at DPD had started thinking about this project, thinking about how we could reorganize our zoning around the train station because we knew it was the right thing to do. And it is the right thing to do for many reasons. One, it's a tool that helps us produce housing to combat homelessness and affordability, and it helps us to think about home ownership. It is the right thing to do also because it is an economic development tool because it provides more spaces for businesses to thrive with foot traffic so that they can be successful. And it is also the right thing to do because it is more sustainable for the city because one of the goals is to have people walk more, use less cars, and so being more environmentally conscious for the city. So regardless of it being a requirement from MBTA, the city needs to do this. And so that's why we were thinking about this way before it was a requirement. So having said that, I'm going to let Fran elaborate on the ordinances, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Camilo. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the proposed zoning changes for the Transit-Oriented Development Overlay District. So in summary, in order to comply with new MBTA communities legislation, we proposed the creation of 3 new zoning overlay districts adjacent to the Gallagher train station in order to keep the city eligible for state grant monies, in addition to the reasons that Camilo listed previously, and also to further streamline redevelopment of existing buildings and development of new residential and mixed-use buildings in our downtown and adjacent neighborhoods. So this is just a map showing the boundaries of the proposed overlay districts. There would be 3 of them, which I'll get into a bit more in the following slides. Just for some background about the MBTA communities legislation, in January 2021, the state voted on a law that required all MBTA communities, including Lowell, to have a zoning district of reasonable size that allows for multifamily residential development by right within a half mile of a transit station. In our case, we have a commuter rail station, and the statute requires that the district has a minimum density of 15 units per acre, is located within a half mile from the station, and that the district shall not be age restricted and suitable for families with children. If a municipality does not comply with this requirement, the municipality will be ineligible to receive funds from the Housing Choice Initiative, Local Capital Project Funds, and MassWorks Infrastructure Development Program. The state has also indicated that the funding we could be excluded from would not be limited to these three programs. It could also include other sources of state funding. Lowell is required to comply with this section of Chapter 40A by December 31st, 2024, so just under 2 years from now. And just for some background on the grants that we've received from 2016 till today, we have received over $8 million from the state from just these three programs. So $300,000 for the Hamilton Canal and Swamp Locks Bridge, $250,000 for brownfields, $50,000 for open space maintenance master plan, $1 million for the Justice Center sidewalks, $1.75 million for the Acre Crossing infrastructure improvements, $250,000 for the master plan, and $4,720,000 for the Streets F&G Hamilton Canal District project. So in addition to the MBTA requirement, these changes are being proposed because we now have a total of 7 public garages throughout and adjacent to this district that are equipped to support new residential development. Removing barriers to development may encourage expedited residential redevelopment of upper floors in our downtown, increasing the housing supply downtown, and also development of new residential buildings on underutilized parcels within this district. Additional housing in and around downtown will really enhance the area's economic development and also add to the housing supply, which will help us to combat rising housing costs in Lowell. So these changes also align with the challenges identified in the Downtown Lowell Rapid Recovery Plan and the objectives outlined in that plan, which include vacancy issues, the need for significant investments in a lot of these buildings, underutilization of properties, needing opportunities for more flexible development and opportunities for more upper story residential uses. It also aligns with the objectives of Sustainable Lowell 2025, which says that we should prioritize land use policies that promote walkable, well-networked neighborhoods. So connecting to what Camilo was saying, we're looking to build a more walkable network of buildings throughout the core of Lowell to really encourage people to take more trips by foot or by bike and not rely on their cars. And then also build and maintain a diversity of housing options throughout the city and prioritizing sustainable housing development policies and practices. It also aligns with a few councilor motions that have gone before this council fairly recently that prioritize encouraging downtown building owners to develop upper floors of buildings and trying to identify ways that we can incentivize downtown building owners to renovate and lease upper floors as residential units. So the MBTA communities legislation and the TOD overlay districts would really address these goals. In addition, based on the parking study completed in 2021, we found that we have plenty of parking capacity downtown. In particular, during overnight hours, there is an abundance of garage parking. At most, the early garage has a utilization of 53%. The Downs garage has a utilization of 44%, and the Roy garage has a utilization of 40%. The 3 other garages that were studied as part of this parking study had overnight utilization of less than 10% each, and this parking study didn't even include the new Hamilton Canal public garage, which my understanding is there's at least 800 vacant parking spaces in that garage. And just for context, we wanted to include developments that have been permitted recently that are very consistent with the MBTA communities legislation, to sort of give you an example of the types of development that would be allowed by right with the passing of this legislation, and that would be potentially expedited as part of this legislation. So this is 201 Canal Street. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's 125 residential units and 5,000 square feet of commercial space. There is no on-site parking, so this building needed to get a variance from the Zoning Board of Appeals to not have on-site parking, and all of the parking is supplied elsewhere at a garage, nearby garage. Same idea for 160 Middlesex Street. There is no on-site parking. The developer, this typology is what would be allowed under the MBTA communities zoning changes, but the developer did have to jump through a lot of hoops to get to this point of developing the building. They had to get site plan review, special permit from the planning board, and a variance from the Zoning Board of Appeals to waive the parking requirement. Another building that was recently redeveloped that would be allowed under this legislation, and the permitting process would be streamlined under this legislation, is 62 Gorham Street, which is formerly home to Dana's Market, as well as 80 Gorham Street next door, which used to house Boston Fish Market. Both of these properties do not have parking on site. It would be supplied at a nearby garage. And then finally 78 to 80 Middlesex Street, which is formerly home to Club Fitness Center. There's no on-site parking here as well. So residents would need to park at a garage. All of these developments were really well received by the boards, and they were very excited about them, but the developer did need to spend significant time and invest a lot of money in the land use board review process. So this legislation would streamline that process, and they would have to face fewer regulatory barriers to get to this outcome. So we're proposing 3 distinct overlay districts, as I mentioned earlier. We're proposing this to ensure that any new development complements the existing urban form in and around downtown. So the first would be the multifamily high-rise district, the second, the multifamily mid-rise district, and then the third, the multifamily neighborhood district. So this is just a map that calls out those 3 districts. As you can see, the multifamily overlay high-rise district is confined to a really small area directly around the train station. The multifamily overlay district, mid-rise, is the largest, and that would be a mid-rise district. And then the multifamily neighborhood overlay district is another smaller one that permits lower intensity of development. So I'll explain each of these districts. The first being the high-rise district. At a glance, the maximum height that we propose to be allowed in this district would be 200 feet or 15 stories. And the parking requirement would be parking at a rate of up to 0.5 spaces per dwelling unit, provided on site such that it is fully accessible to the general public 24 hours a day. And the entirety of this parking supply may be provided off-site, and the entirety of any parking provided in excess of this rate must be provided off-site. The reason that the parking requirement is up to 0.5 parking spaces at this location is because this is right next to the train station. So the highest and best use of real estate next to the train station is not surface parking. We've also, as part of the planning process, developing this plan, we walked through the LRTA garages, and there is a lot of space in those garages. They're very underutilized. So the thought being here was that we could push the parking supply into those garages, plus the public garages, the other public garages that we have in the city, rather than take up space next to the asset, which is the train station with surface parking. The next zoning district would be the mid-rise zoning district. This would allow a maximum height of 85 feet or 7 stories, and the parking rate would be a rate of up to 1 spaces per dwelling unit. Again, it may be provided off-site, and any parking in excess of that must be provided off-site. Again, the idea being that the highest and best use of the areas shown in the green is not a sea of parking, it's more housing. And if we require too high of a parking requirement, it's going to be prohibitive for developers, which is contrary to the goals of this legislation. And then finally, the multifamily overlay neighborhood district is smaller, and it includes the areas around Middlesex Street and Little Cambodia. This is a lower rise district with a maximum height of 35 feet and 3 stories. The parking requirement here would be at least 0.5 spaces per dwelling unit may be provided on site. The entirety of the parking supply may also be provided off-site, and we feel that this is an appropriate parking requirement for this zoning district. And I just wanted to note that site plan review is still required for any new development with more than 3 dwelling units. So while this legislation would allow developments to be permitted by right with respect to the use, so a board couldn't deny something based on the proposed use, and it also would greatly reduce the parking requirement. The planning board would still maintain oversight over the site design, the layout, the parking circulation, any shadow studies, emergency vehicle access. So a public hearing would still be occurring for any development of over 3 units, but the board would not be able to deny the development based on the use, but they could theoretically deny it based on other things if it doesn't meet our standard for site plan review. And also wanted to note that much of the districts shown in the map are within the downtown Lowell Historic District. So in addition to, or actually when something is in the historic district, it goes to the historic board instead of the planning board. So for any developments over 3 units, it would either receive basically design review by the planning board or the historic board. So I just linked the full text to the proposed zoning language changes. The full draft of the language includes a use table for each proposed overlay district more in detail, and also it details the development standards that were included with the objectives of creating a high-quality residential neighborhood, increasing the supply of housing units in the district, and not interfering with the privacy and amenities of adjacent properties. So basically there's design standards built into the draft language that I encourage all of you to read, because there's very thoughtful, and the team and consultant worked really hard to be thoughtful about the standards. So we're happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And before I turn it over to questions from any members of the subcommittee. I did just want to take a moment to recognize other city staff who are here joining us in the chamber. We were joined by Councilor Mercier and are currently joined by Councilor Noon, as well as City Solicitor Helene Tomlinson, Building Commissioner David Fuller, Assistant City Manager Sean Machado, and from the City Manager's Office, Melissa DeRoche. I, at this point, would like to open it up to members of the subcommittee for any comments or questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the detailed proposal of the MBTA zoning overlay, and I think this is very, very critical. And I, for one, would support the proposed so that we can meet the state guideline by December of 2024. Because there's a lot of money will be coming to communities such as Lowell. With the current governor mission is to build more affordable housing for the Commonwealth, and this would be perfect timing for the city of Lowell to implement this and to get funding and to move on, create more housing stock for the city of Lowell. The only thing that I would like to comment is that, number one, with all these development that you have listed here, are they going to meet the 15 unit per acre by the MBTA zone ordinance?
So my understanding is that the requirement is just that it is zoned to accommodate at least that density at minimum. But the parcels that are zoned that way aren't all going to comply with that requirement. We're just required to have zoning that allows for a density of at least 15 units per acre.
Okay, all right, just to have that, but not necessary to have physical units that are already in the...
Correct, it's not
okay.
a building mandate,
Right.
it's creating a regulatory environment that
Right.
allows people to create
Right.
developments of at
right.
least 15 units per acre.
Now, if you may, I'd like you to put the map back up so people at home can see. And the only thing I look at it and I say, why the multifamily overlay neighborhood, it's so small compared to the mid-rise. Now, I would like to have the DPD to take a look at to include additional neighborhood in the multifamily overlay neighborhood, to include, if you come from Middlesex Street, the Lord Overpass coming down Middlesex Street will be on the left. On your right, there would be a road that I'd like to include called Middlesex Place. So if you could add that Middlesex Place, and then then add on to where the Boys and Girls Club is, and then continue on past the Clemente Park, and then you also add the section that including I'm so sorry. Yeah, if you could include the a street called Sanders Street, and then Payne Street, and then connect it all the way to the canal on one side, and then up to School Street. So if you come from that Payne Street and School Street is the bridge there before the other side of the canal is so you come on School Street, you come to Middlesex Street, and now from Middlesex Street you continue to Branch Street, and then also then you go on to Westford Street. But I would like to see, in addition to that, it go all the way to Westford Street on School Street. The School Street will meet Liberty Street. So Liberty Street then cut back to Chelmsford Street. Chelmsford Street then make its way back to the Gallagher Station. So that area in itself is really undeveloped, and then has a lot of multi-level, multi-family units that can be retrofit to meet this to additional unit for the zoning that we talked about here. That's add on more housing stocks in the area, encourage more development in that underutilized for that particular neighborhood, multifamily overlay neighborhood. That would be my suggestion. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And if maybe what I hope to do after a couple brief comments is to entertain a motion to approve of these zoning changes and make a recommendation for adoption by the full City Council at a future meeting, not tonight, but at a future meeting. So perhaps in the interim, if you could just review those potential suggestions, and eventually when it comes back to the council, we can address any changes that may have occurred between now and then. But before entertaining that motion, I did just want to briefly comment that I, as well, am in full support of these changes. As was mentioned earlier in the meeting, we are somewhat compelled to make some of these changes as a result of a state law. So there is a bit of a stick approach to this, but I will say that, as Mr. Esposito mentioned, that these do align with more longstanding city goals for transit-oriented development, and I think the state law was a good one to compel all communities to take on this sort of development, and I'm glad we're moving in this direction. So even without the potential for the loss of MassWorks funding and other state grants, I think this is a very, these are important changes to address things like the housing affordability crisis that we talk about just about every week in this council, and ways to supply more housing for the residents of Lowell, as well as to make walkable communities so more residents can access and utilize tremendous assets that we have in the city, like the commuter rail. So we've also addressed similar changes very recently in this council in the downtown mixed-use zone, trying to eliminate barriers that might prevent a developer from attempting to create more housing or different uses for properties, just because of that administrative or regulatory barrier of coming before a land use board to get approval for that. So I think by making these changes essentially to buy right, I mean, these aren't big changes in our community. I mean, many communities are grappling with wholesale changes and what type of zoning they allow. Here in this city, we're looking at zones where we're not significantly changing the zoning, but lowering regulatory barriers to developing housing. And I think we will see a really positive impact as a result of that. So I'm glad that we're addressing this early on, and will hopefully become one of the lead communities in the state to adopt these changes and begin to implement what's required under the MBTA Communities Act. So just wanted to make those brief comments, and I think these are very positive changes. So at this point, if there are no other questions or comments, before we move on that, Councilor Leahy.
Sure, just when you incorporate those changes, could you just send it to the committee so we could take a sneak peek?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Nice job.
Great. Thank you. Councilor Noon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too think this is a no-brainer. We've been trying for years to add to the housing stock that we face in the city. Give it the concerns also is that not just the $8 million that we receive up to date from the state for housing choice, capital project fund, and/or mass infrastructure development, but the concern is that if we not comply, we're not just the city losing it. I think also that the nonprofit that receiving state fund may be impacted by we are not comply with the MBTA community district. So I think the other things that I may suggest that maybe this share this info with the zoning and the planning, and to also seek their input as well before it come back to the council for vote. I will vote in support of it when that time comes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just also want to note that we've been joined in the chamber by Councilor Scott, and I recognize you, Councilor Mercier, just after you had stepped out. So, and I'll just make a slight clarification to the, before I entertain a motion. This is obviously a very comprehensive presentation, so we will summarize this meeting later on at the full council, but I think before bringing anything for a vote before the full council, we would like to have a similar presentation in the packet for the full city council to consider. So with that, Chair would entertain a motion to recommend these changes after a brief comment from Councilor Yam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick question regarding the housing units that are supposed to be built in the MBTA zone district. Are they particularly for rental or a combination of rental and ownership? And the reason I'm saying this because I would like to see maybe units ownership that will help, low income, low moderate income family build a generational wealth, down the street. So not just being renters, but also home ownership in that multi-units as well.
So the law does not specify, and generally zoning doesn't distinguish between ownership or rental units. It just refers to a housing unit. It treats them the same.
I would love to see that we would, add some ownership to it, so this way for family to have a generational wealth built into owning units, and statistics show if they own a property, they take good care of it, they belong, they feel a sense of belonging and stuff like that. So I'm a big proponent of the home ownership, and that my previous life teaching first-time home buy classes to the community as well. So that's just something to consider. Thank you so much for the report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a motion to recommend these changes to the full city council? So moved by Councilor Yam, seconded by Councilor Leahy. Mr. Clerk, can you please call the roll? Yes.
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 Thank you very much. So we will bring these recommendations and this presentation to the full city council at a future meeting. That concludes the topics on the agenda for tonight's zoning subcommittee meeting. So Chair would entertain a motion to adjourn. So moved and second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, no.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.